Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the perennialist or the traditionalist school of thought in spirituality. My guest is the poet and writer Charles Upton. His first two books of poetry, Panic Grass in 1968 and Time Raid in 1969, were published by City Lights in San Francisco, known for publishing the works of the great Beat poets. And you might say he was the youngest member of the Beat generation, considering that he was a high school student at the time these books were published. He subsequently became engaged in metaphysics and the traditionalist movement and is author of many books, including Hammering Hot Iron, a spiritual critique of Robert Bly's Iron John. Folk Metaphysics, mystical meanings in traditional folk songs and spirituals. Cracks in the Great Wall, UFOs and traditional metaphysics. Knowings in the arts of metaphysics, cosmology, and the spiritual path. The science of the Greater Jihad, essays in principial psychology. The system of the Antichrist, truth and falsehood in postmodernism and the New Age. Vectors of the counter-initiation, the course and destiny of inverted spirituality. Dugan against Dugan, a traditionalist critique of the fourth political theory. And most recently, although we won't really be touching on this book today, but I hope to do so in a future interview, The Alien Disclosure Deception, the Metaphysics of Social Engineering. Charles lives in Lexington, Kentucky, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Charles. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Well, it's great to be here with you as well. This is, if we call this with, this is the way with is nowadays.
With in virtual reality, or as my parapsychological friends sometimes like to say, non-local reality.
It's non-local, yeah. Okay, that sounds better. Yeah. So.
I think a good starting point might be the fact that you and I both had what I would regard as a good, solid friendship with a wonderful man, Huston Smith, when we each lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I think he had a big impact on both of us.
Yes. I mean, Huston was, I always say, a gentleman and a scholar. If you want to, that's an old phrase that used to be thrown around, but it certainly applied to him perfectly. And, I mean, he summed up so much of all of the lore and information and, visions of what all the other, quote, religions were, for that time, and presented it in a beautiful and accessible way. And I keep saying when he passed on, he took his time with him, like few people. You could say the Huston Smith era is now definitely over.
Why do you say that?
Well, because things have become he was a sunny personality and things have become darker, and that's it was really before. It's where you could collect the religions together, and this is still being done in places. You could have the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu and everyone, in one room and smiling at each other. And now, if that is still going on, it rings a little hollow because there's so much conflict between everything and everything now. So, and it's nice to still be able to do that when there's so much conflict. It's not useless, but it isn't the keynote of our time, if you will.
Well, I am under the impression that since our time together, and in a way, you and I both came of age in California in the 1970s. So we have that in common. But I have a sense that our paths diverge somewhere along the way. And in particular, you are now strongly affiliated with the Traditionalist school of spirituality. And Huston, I think, bordered on that school, but I'm not sure he was ever a member of it.
Well, he was a member at one point. I mean, like I call him. You talk about serial monogamy. He was like, serial monotheism or something. And there was a definite phase where that's what he was, and then, the last years I knew him, he was there and starting to move on to something else a bit. So, but. Well, certainly, he was considered by Sayyid Hussein Nasr to be. I'm sort of, this is partly jocular, but like sort of the muqaddam for the west of the Mississippi region, and he, we certainly. Yeah, he was a traditionalist and a member of the initiate of the Frithjof Schuon's Maryamia Tarika when we knew him. So.
Oh, okay, now you've introduced several terms, and it'll be useful to clarify these for our viewers.
Frithjof Schuon was this guy who, while he was alive, I guess he passed away in 1999, I think, and he was sort of the head of the traditionalist school. I think most people would agree, or at least you say the Anglo-Swiss branch of the traditionalist school. I mean, for the English-speaking world and for some other parts of the world, he's from Switzerland himself. And so he was, and there were other branches. There were some branches who followed René Guénon and had not moved, on from him, but were following his teachings exclusively, or were still around. And there were the people following Julius Evola, who was sort of the right wing, almost fascist, a writer of associated with the traditionalist school. But Frithjof Schuon was sort of the top guy in many people's minds while he was alive. So. And the Maryamia Tarika was his and is his Sufi order, which used to be called the Maryamia Shadili Tarika because it was he got his initiation through Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi, who was a great Sufi master of North Africa of the Alawiya order, which is a branch of the Shadili order. And he founded his own Sufi order, which was a bit off the central tradition of Sufism. He was doing his own thing to a degree. It was some very interesting and some a little bit extreme things that he was doing. But he put us through our paces. Put it that way. So, I was never an initiate of that order, but my wife actually was.
I see, but you do consider yourself a Sufi these days.
Well, yes, if I consider myself anything, I'm like I say, I'm between sheikhs at this point, because being a sheikh at a time like this, being a recognized spiritual teacher, is a rather difficult position to maintain without, getting into various forms of difficulty.
Well, to my understanding, the traditionalist school basically, it's non-denominational in the sense that it honors the various traditions, but it also suggests that a true spiritual path must involve one of the recognized spiritual traditions, whether it's Islam or Buddhism or Christianity. I'm not sure if Judaism counts.
There was one, there was someone who came out of Judaism. I believe he converted to Islam. But one of the best writers on Kabbalah was Leo Shaya, wrote The Universal Meaning of the Kabbalah. And he was certainly of the traditionalist school. So yeah, your characterization is correct. Understanding that all of the major traditions have an esoteric element, which these elements are not identical, but they are equivalent, and they're pointing closer and closer to the same reality from their different standpoints. But just like if you're going to climb a mountain, you can't climb by two routes at the same time. If you try, your legs are going to be very far apart. It's going to be hard to walk. So you have to go up one, and that's. Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, almost said the same thing. He was tending in that direction. Well, we've tried everything under the sun, but now let's find a path and stick with it.
And so for that reason, what some sociologists would call the new religions are less appealing because the path is less well trodden.
Well, it's less well trodden, and there's a question. I'm not going to turn around and say the Baha'i are not a real religion, because it's none of my business. Someone may find God through the Baha'i, and more power to them. But the new religions, they don't seem to have the breadth, perhaps even initially that the great revelations have. There's a certain very important insight that comes to one person or a group of people, and they form a practice and a doctrine around it. And this is good up to a point, but there's something larger and more full and more complete and more grounded in the major revelations. That's one way of saying it. The other thing you have to say is, though, that the traditions are not in good shape now. You see them all weakening and losing their definition. So in times like this, to stay with a traditionalist standpoint and just say, I'm going to stay with one of the major revelations, it's a bet. You're making a bet that this is going to, and you can't do this and do the opposite at the same time. So you don't know what it would have been if you've gone a different way. But it has difficulties now that it didn't used to have, because these religions used to be within the matrix of a complete religious civilization that would inform them. And, like I say with Sufism, for example, in a golden age of Islam, where and whenever you want to say that was, you had so many things going on. You had the philosophers were doing philosophy, and the alchemists were doing alchemy, and the religious scholars were doing, fiqh and studying Sharia, and the artists were doing art, and all this was going on. And then so when someone came to the door of the Sufi master, it was a good bet that he or she really wanted to find God directly, and get do as intensive spiritual practice as was available in Islam. But now, when people go to the Sufi master or to any master, it's who knows what they're looking for, because we don't have an integral civilization, and our lives are disordered. And people may be looking for, not just a spiritual master, that too, but also a psychiatrist, someone to, help them with their craziness, or a father figure, or a lover, or somebody who will, help with financial dealings. You'll have a nice group you can schmooze with, for business purposes, and God knows why people do it, because Sufi orders have had to sort of, as Islamic civilization, as all civilizations have shrunk, they've sort of tried to take on all the roles that were being abandoned or lost, in other parts of the civilization. So that's a universal problem with traditional religions at this point.
I think it would be useful for our viewers to have a sense of how you came of age as probably the very youngest of the Beat Generation poets. Your work was published by Lawrence Ferlinghetti in City Light Books in San Francisco back in the late 1960s.
Well, let's see. Once upon a time. Once upon a time, I was going to Catholic high school in Marin County, California, Marin Catholic High School. And my friend Bill Trumbley phoned me up and said, I'm taking this poetry little workshop thing at College of Marin, but I'm too hungover to go, so why don't you go in my place? So what I did is I went in his place, and this was a tiny little some sort of poetry workshop, which was run by Beat Generation poet Lou Welch. And there was that day, there was only him and me and Sister Mary Norbert Kutte, who was a Dominican nun at that point and also a poet. And there was Lou Welch. And basically, that's how I got close to the Beat Generation. What he did was very interesting. He didn't want to talk to us about poetry. He wanted to teach us perception exercises, which is, well, okay, whatever, this is free. I might as well go along with it. And he said, that there was a grove of redwoods, a little stand of redwoods right there. And he said, okay, look at those redwood trees. Now imagine that the redwood trunks are empty spaces and that the spaces between the trunks are solid. Just, flip your perception like that. And I looked at it and I said, oh yeah, I can sort of see that, And I thought, well, that's interesting, whatever. It's amazing what that became in later years. That really, there was a time when I was meditating in Gerstle Park in San Rafael, California, with my eyes open, which I used to. And there was another redwood grove there, and I was meditating there. And then that really happened. And the spaces between the redwood trees, the redwood trees became empty, and the spaces between them became birch trees. And suddenly, well, now I'm in a birch forest. And it was a birch forest, just as clear as a bell, and I said, well, that's interesting, And so, something was coming out of that guy, But anyway, he introduced me to, see, the Beat Generation was getting their second wind, and they were getting their first real mass audience of their own kind of people that they could talk to. Before they were a phenomenon that, Edward R. Murrow or someone says, there are these people called Beatniks. What are they? What are they doing? Oh, whatever. But the hippies really, came into being partly because of what the Beats were doing. And so they had a chance to speak, to sort of give their manifesto and their view of reality to a younger generation. So he was, introducing me around. He introduced me to, who all was it? Lawrence Ferlinghetti, of course, and Robert Duncan and Robert Creeley and Philip Whalen and Gary Snyder and a whole bunch of people, and anytime, we go over to Bolinas and see the Bolinas poets and this. And it was very interesting. I mean, I because right after that little class, I showed him some of my stuff, and he wrote me back a letter, and he says, you can be a poet if you want to. I said, well, I guess I do. Okay, all right. And, he set me up with a big reading at Glide Memorial Church, where I read my poem Panic Grass, which was sort of my version of a combination of Kerouac and Neil Cassidy driving across the USA and long-lined, high energy poetry like Howl. And I put it all together, and it was a creditable poem. It came from a trip I'd taken around the U.S. with a friend of mine in 1967. And the next year, I wrote it that winter, and then I presented it, and I read it at Glide Memorial Church with a high energy declamatory reading. And Ferlinghetti came up afterwards and says, I want to publish that poem. It's now your name will be in lights and all of this and all of this. which was interesting. But I didn't go with it. I said, okay, that's interesting. Great. I'm glad that happened. Okay, cool. But I don't know. Do I have anything else to say? Will I ever write another poem? Who am I to run around with these guys? And I never did a public reading of Panic Grass after that night. So that was one of the many worlds that I have been on the edge of. I mean, I've been on the edge of so many worlds, just, the fly on the wall. And so I never became entirely identified with one of them, so I could pass from one to the other. And I see people, somebody becomes a poet, and now 45 years later, they're still in North Beach and they're still a poet, and that's what they are. And I just didn't want to do that. I said there's more to things than that, So.
Well, coming of age in the 60s and 70s in the San Francisco Bay Area, as you mentioned, it was the summer of love. It was the time of the hippies. LSD was plentiful at the time. And undoubtedly, you were exposed to that, as I was at that time.
Yeah. Well, yes. And that went along with the Beat Generation territory as well, because they were right in the middle of that as well. And, I was there with the first human bee in Golden Gate Park, where Timothy Leary was saying, turn on, tune in, drop out of your schools, drop out of your sororities, drop out, and he was going, and I just remember he was really preaching to the choir. Everybody was so stoned and said, sure, Tim, whatever. Yeah, right. I think we've already heard this one, And I remember, the Hell's Angels standing on top of the generator truck guarding, And, who was on that stage? Lou Welch was there. Allen Ginsberg was there. Gary Snyder was there. Dizzy Gillespie was there with his, trumpet, the bent up trumpet thing, And but, made a bunch of scenes. Yes. And LSD, well, what a thing. And you just wonder what that ever did to you, because you get very high, apparently very high insights, very high realizations. And yet, it was a kind of a rape of the psyche by some chemical, and God knows what that really did, And I'm just wondering, if you really have an experience of, let us say, God or unitary being or the clear light of the void or whatever from taking a chemical, maybe somewhere that, that implants in you a deeply materialistic assumption. Well, it all came from a chemical. Maybe it's all chemical. Maybe it's all brain chemistry, And it's a way, even if you don't believe that, as some idea you hold to, it seems to have been demonstrated pretty clearly by taking a pill, So there were a lot of downsides to it, which we did not understand and may never understand, because society, let's face it, started to really come apart at that point. And understandably, because the mindset of the 50s was a terrible paralysis. It was a strange, something to do with PTSD after World War II. We won the war, we're on top. We're the most powerful nation on earth, and we're all rich. On the other hand, nuclear weapons, and that did something to people. People froze in a way I have never seen before or since. Just looking what I know from movies, look at movies in the 30s, people were, a lot more sure of themselves and a lot hipper than they were in the 50s. So something had to be, that there had to be compensation for that strange state, and that's what the Beats came up with. And so good, I'm glad they did, but things started to unravel at that point, because things always do. Things grow and then they die, and that's when I always say, the peak of the U.S. expansion, or the expansion of Western civilization, weren't the hippies the spearhead of Western civilization? Onward to Vietnam. I didn't want to do that. And then, I would say, well, when Jimi Hendrix died, when was that? 1969 or something, and 70, and that was the end. That was the peak, and it's been downhill ever since. Well, who knows? It's a counterculture perspective on Western civilization.
Well, I am under the impression that, in a sense, you became very disenchanted with the counterculture and sought, let's say, refuge in the traditionalist movement.
Yeah, this happened. I mean, let's see. At one point, in the early '80s, I mean, I was doing whatever seemed to be coming out of the counterculture until then, and then I was. My wife and I became the elders of a small Presbyterian church in San Rafael. And we were brought in by the lady minister who wanted to pack the session, which is the governing body of the church, in order to have the church vote to become involved in the sanctuary movement for Central American refugees. And so, we came in and so, we were insurgents, but we were nice insurgents. People didn't hate us. A few people left in disgust, but it didn't really split the congregation, which means that there's a lot of very strange people ended up doing something very radical, very straight yet eccentric kind of people. There was one couple that I said were the real Fred and Ethel Mertz. They were old vaudeville people, going to a Presbyterian church. It was very strange. So we did, and we wanted to believe that the left was the good guys, right? And then we found out the left is just a bunch of politicos who are also you have the death squads, the Salvadoran death squads. Then you have the left that's also doing some pretty bad stuff, and they were sort of lying to us, and they thought we were idiots. There's little cadre people from El Salvador here in San Francisco Bay Area. They thought we were idiots who would believe anything they said. And I remember, we had some event. They said, communists? Oh, no, there are no communists in El Salvador. And I thought, oh, yeah, okay. And I just saw, well, this is sort of as far as we can go in this direction, and then after that, we decided, because it sort of fell apart, that church, in a rather sad way, which I won't belabor you with. But then we said, well, let's do the New Age. Let's see because it came out of the counterculture. Maybe there's something interesting is going on there. So about 2 years, my wife and I we were with Global Family. I don't know if they still exist. And we're doing citizen diplomacy with the Soviet Union. And, we're doing international peace prayer days, and ended up with harmonic convergence. And, I actually my wife and I led a retreat for harmonic convergence on Mount Tamalpais. Wow, that's the New Age. And so I was doing that, and then I said, wait a minute, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I'm just opening, we're doing, lucid dream work and this and ad hoc shamanism and weird rituals we invented. And what the hell is this? So I said, I don't know what I'm doing. So I just said, okay, let's just cool it here. And then when I said cool it, what appeared was the Ni'matullahi Sufi order from Iran under Dr. Javad Nurbakhsh. Actually, my wife converted to Islam. She says, one day says, hey, I'm going to become a Muslim. I said, okay, whatever. And so I sort of followed her. And then she didn't stay there very long. She moved on. But she was a Muslim long enough to make me a Muslim. And then she went on and became a Christian again of a more, a traditional stripe of Christianity. So I was there for 20 years. And it was, there were imperfections. There were, the things that you get in a spiritual group, which you don't think are quite kosher and don't seem to be, but so what? Something was definitely going on, because I went in there And I'd been probably at this point a pretty serious alcoholic for about 15 years. And I went in there and I never took another drink. I went, oh, it's against the rules to drink if you're a Muslim, so cool. So I quit, just like that. And it's not like the cravings disappeared. The cravings would come and then they would go and then they would come back and they would go for years and years. But I never took another drink. So something was going on. And during that period, I was recollecting myself because I blasted myself in so many different directions. I said I will take every drug once. And I didn't do DMT and ayahuasca, but I did everything else. And trying Kundalini yoga, Yogi Bhajan, who is the teacher of Kundalini yoga, a Sikh teacher, and he would just come and he just came and says, hippies, do you want to get high without drugs? Try breath of fire and you see what happens, and something, it blew my subtle nervous system to the four winds. And, it took me several years to get back into my body on any stable, ongoing way. And it was another excess, So I just sat there for 20 years at the Namatulahi Hanukkah in San Francisco and just didn't say a word, hardly. I just said, I'm just going to sit here and say the name of God and collect all the fugitive fragments of myself. So it was very good for that.
I might have rubbed shoulders with you at the Kundalini Yoga Ashram in San Anselmo. I practiced Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini Yoga for several years.
I wasn't at the ashram. He came by once, and there was some place, I forget what it was, and a bunch of them were doing, Kundalini yoga exercises, and I sat down with him and did some, and one time two or three times, right? And one time Yogi Bhajan came by. So I looked at him and I just said, you're really experienced, because I was thinking of a song, are you really experienced?
Jimi Hendrix,
or have you ever been experienced? And I said, you're really experienced. I remember he said one thing. He says, we're coming from the Piscean age to the Aquarian age. In the Piscean age, it's Jupiter. Jupiter is generous and helpful, and Jupiter says, learn spirituality and become more spiritual, and wonderful rewards will be yours. You will get all these wonderful things. But now we're moving into the Aquarian age, ruled by Saturn, and Saturn says, you better learn your spirituality, my friend, or else, and that, I think that was in very vague general terms, I think that was very accurate, it's, because this is not the time where we can try all sorts of things and get all sorts of different interesting inputs, that don't seem to have any center, but boy, aren't they entertaining. That's just not this time. We got to get it right now, or there will be serious consequences. But Kundalini yoga, I practiced it in the worst possible way with not doing nothing to purify or simplify my habits, of self-indulgence of one kind or another, and without ongoing, without a trainer, much, who could, like, what happens when the energy gets weird and it goes like this and that, and hopefully they knew the technical parts of it enough to say, all you need to do is this, or now it's time to do more of that. And I did not have that kind of guidance. And so all I could do was go for the extreme, raise the Kundalini, get it to the Sahasrara and see what happens, and it's very, it's as if I'd burned a lot of karma, because it brought up a lot of unconscious attachments and, karmic residues or whatever that I may have never encountered in this life if I hadn't done something so radical. But it was extremely disorienting and very painful sometimes.
So you found in Sufism something that seemed like a better path for you.
Well, it was what was good is obedience. You know what they say. That's one of the most important things in Western monasticism. You know, you poverty, chastity, and obedience. Thomas Merton said about those three vows of any Western monk virtually is he says poverty, that's a cinch, you know. Chastity, well, it takes some getting used to. He says obedience, that's the kicker, you know, because you know he had a series of abbots who were not geniuses. He was a genius. The abbots were just regular monks, you know, and it was hard for a guy that smart and that perceptive to obey somebody that he thought, well, this guy, you know, I can run rings around this guy when it comes to intelligence. Why am I obeying him? Well, because obedience it disconnects your self-will. Sometimes that's the only way to do it. Why do we do it? Why am I supposed to do this? Is this going to work? No, you're supposed to do it because I say so and because this is the rule, okay? And just that practice is very good if you need to collect yourself, especially if you've been a very freelance spiritual type who's tried everything and thought, you know, he could invent his own religion over any given weekend, you know, if he, you know, and that's, so that was very good for me. It had downsides, but so does everything.
Well, one of the things I've noticed as I've gone through your many books is that there is a theme, and that theme is to be quite critical of various aspects of popular culture, whether it's the men's movement or the fascination people have with UFOs or
the New Age or in my next book is going to treat the traditionalists to that kind of, you know, gently, if I can do it, you know, gentle critique, because they are a wonderful course to take without doubt. And yet, well, okay. What's interesting is, did you ever read A Vision by William Butler Yeats?
Yes.
Okay. You know those, what are there, 22 phases, or how many phases are there? I forget.
I don't recall either.
No, there are 28 phases of this big cycle in which everything exists, you know, and it's a vision of history. It's a vision of eschatology, life after death. And one of the things is character types. And so if you look at under what phase of the moon I was born, I am a phase 11, which is called the consumer, the pyre builder. And it says, let's see if I can remember this. The consumer, he's involved with a challenge and a critique of the ideas, you know, of his kin, basically, of his, you know, and it says this critique is forced upon him almost to the breaking of his heart, and it said no character without the stroke of fate so divides itself in two. You know, it's like I had to do it. I had to go after. I said that's not right. That's not clear enough. That could create a problem, you know. And I mean, it's amazing. I've found, in very general terms, astrology to be more or less true, but nothing has been so true for me as that weird channeled system that came, you know, to W.B. Yeats through his wife as the medium. It was so strange. I mean, where the hell did that? It's like, and you know, and of course, I would criticize the Order of the Golden Dawn. You know, I mean, but look, something came through them anyway, you know, or came through him, and it was true, you know. So yeah, I that's what I've had to do. That's what I've had to do. And And who else? Who was supposed to be? Oh, it was Spinoza. I don't know Spinoza well enough. Spinoza was supposed to be phase 11. But the one that comes to mind, which isn't in Yeats's list, was a Savonarola, the bonfire of the vanities, right? And that's very much what my writing is, as you're right. That's a keynote in my writing.
A lot of your critique is done from the perspective of the traditionalist school. And I think one aspect of that school, and I think it's fair to say it's pretty much found in all the major religions, is the idea of the satanic or the diabolic being a force in history, a force in this world.
I would say at this point, who can deny it? But if you wish to deny it, go ahead. But I mean, really, I think that's becoming clearer all the time. I was just a big Satanist convention in someplace in Arizona, I forget where, and where they were, teaching how to start Satan clubs in your kids' school, Satanism for children and this and this. And of course, they'll say, well, Satan isn't as bad as he was portrayed. Evil, what's evil? Or he isn't that evil. Or, he's your friend. He's against, the Puritanism that limits your potential. Whatever. I don't know how he's being presented. But anybody who's looked into the Satanist world knows that it's a lot worse than that,
And as I recall from a previous conversation that we had, you felt that there's no area of society that hasn't been corrupted by this force.
Yeah, I think we are at the point of, truly the latter days, the last days of the Kali Yuga. Here we are. It's not that every individual or every institution has necessarily been corrupted, but that influence is there as a threat, if not as a realized damage, everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Yeah.
It would be hard to deny that that's a very good posture to criticize various social movements from, because they all have their weaknesses.
Their weaknesses, and a social movement is what do I say? Politics is the art of the ephemeral. It's possible to make a real political commitment to something, particularly around an issue, rather than whatever the Democrats say or whatever the Republicans say is right. And that's proving itself to be very shaky ground these days. But there are certain issues, plant more trees, for example. That's a good one, and it's possible to make a real commitment, and that means something in these times. It's not like, you can't make a political commitment. And certainly what I did from 2013 to 2018, I guess, 2019 was the Covenants Initiative, which was certainly, a peace movement with a political aspect to it. So, and that was worth doing. But it was interesting. I found one that was coming directly out of tradition, out of one of the major religions. And, quickly to say, the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad were made with different religious groups of his time. And in his place and time, the religious groups and there wasn't civil society like we have now. You had a village over there that was surrounding a monastery, and so the abbot of the monastery was more or less the mayor of the village, so to speak, and that's the way society was organized. And so, in attempting to make a federation of different peoples of the book, which is what he was doing, and this is manifested in his Constitution of Medina, he would go to these different communities and make treaties with them called covenants, and they would say, if you will pledge not to be at war with Islam, we will pledge to not only leave you alone, but to help you. If your buildings become damaged, the Muslims should repair them, and we will have a federation, because these were people in that place and time were living on the edges of big empires, the Byzantine Empire, Persian Empire, and there were a lot of little groups who were not looked at, say, from the Byzantine standpoint. They were Christian groups, but they might have been looked at as heretical or suspect, or, in any case, they weren't the real Christians, and so they were heavily taxed. And so Islam could come to them with a better deal, So it's interesting that representatives of the Prophet would go to these groups and say, well, let's make a covenant, but let's just keep it under wraps. And maybe the time will come when you will see Muslim armies at your door. So bring out the covenant and show that, that the Prophet has granted you protection. But when the inspector general or whatever it is from the Byzantine Empire comes by, you better keep it under wraps, So it was a very smart kind of diplomacy that was being done. Because, we can say, how did the Muslim armies expand so fast into such a vast area? Well, there was a lot of groundwork being laid, and that's one of the ways it was being done. So anyway, my view and my partner in this was Dr. John Andrew Morrow, who actually was our leader and still is. And what he did is he brought these documents forward and saved them from obscurity, saved them from scholarly obscurity. They were almost being forgotten. What are these? These are some old documents that don't count anymore, or those groups no longer exist, or this was the basis actually of the policy of the Ottoman Empire, official policy having to do with treatment of religious minorities. But when the Ottoman Empire fell, it looked like, well, these are just old bureaucratic documents of some empire that doesn't exist anymore. And so people started to forget them. But I had Dr. Morrow did amazing scholarly work, traveled the world, went to libraries. I mean, you couldn't believe, some of these, and some of our colleagues did this as well, going to ancient monasteries in the Near East and saying, we think you probably have a covenant, and finding these things. It was an amazing job. And so he was doing that. But basically, I came forward and I said, look, and I made a big pitch to the publisher of Angelico, I guess it's Angelico Press that finally published his book, which is called The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the World. And I made a big pitch to them, and I said, look, we've got to do this book. And I was also making a pitch to Dr. Morrow at the same time. I've got to do this book, and it's got to be both scholarly and political. We can't be one or the other. Because if it had been just a scholarly thing, it would have been one of these books that for $75 or $100 you can buy one copy and for the library, and that's it. And it would have sold 100 copies sitting in libraries and no one would ever read. But I said, we got to make a movement out of this, because ISIS was coming up, and these documents were saying flat out, in the words of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, which Dr. Moore proved with incredible scholarship, that these came directly from originals that were composed by him, the paper trail, and these documents were saying anyone who does what ISIS does will earn the curse of Allah and his prophet, and it was an incredible time for these things to come forward. And actually ISIS helped our movement, because if there hadn't been an ISIS, people wouldn't have understood the need for these documents. So as we brought them forward, people said, "Well, this is what we need." Well, and it was basically an interfaith initiative and a sense of what you say, social justice and human rights that was coming directly out of Islam itself. It wasn't coming from some Western ideology that was pasted onto Islam, which is always a very, uneasy marriage. It didn't go back to the French Revolution. It went back to the Prophet Muhammad. And so that's just what was needed then. So this is like political, but I was able to put together a political effort with traditionalism, with something that was coming directly out of, because the Prophet Muhammad said these documents were inspired directly by Allah. So I said, all right, let's see what happens if we do something that is entirely traditional and yet entirely political and yet not fundamentalist, and so we did it. It's still going on. We don't know because people took it away. We were only two people, and a few colleagues and allies who would appear from time to time. And so, a lot of people took it away and made it their own, which is, because we don't want to sit here and try to manage some movement that we don't have, give us a little funding first, maybe we'll do that. But we did it almost without funding. And it became an international movement. The final, proof of it was that the Christian woman Asia Bibi in Pakistan, like 7 or 8 or 9 years ago, was she had said, I get the idea. I see. This probably isn't the way it happened, but this is the legend I'm going to invent. She's there at the river with the other women, washing the clothes, and they diss her. The other women say, "Christian girl, who's this?" And she said something apparently like, "Well, what did your prophet ever do? My leader was the son of God," and something like, just a little tiff. But this little tiff became, she was arrested and kept in prison for 7 years under threat of execution for blasphemy. And finally, it got to the Pakistan Supreme Court, who ruled on it. And when they ruled on it, they cited Dr. Morrow's book and the documents that he brought forward as one of their reasons for acquitting her. So she was acquitted, and she was spirited out of Pakistan before the mob of fundamentalist, Salafi Wahhabis came and got her, and I think she's in Canada now. So in other words, if you can help say one person, what it says in the Quran, he was killed one person as if he'd killed the whole human race. He was saved one person as if he'd saved the whole human race. And so that's, so I won't say you can't do politics, but I wanted to have it on a real basis, in a real spiritual basis. So.
Would you say that the traditionalist movement, as you see it and as you represent it, is quite distinct, therefore, from the fundamentalist movements in these various religions?
The fundamentalists hate the traditionalists. Because the traditionalists will accept other religions than Islam. I'm talking about the fundamentalists of Islam, but they're also fundamentalists, of course, in every religion. But will accept other religions than Islam as equally valid and as revelations of God. So, really, tradition and conservatism, or tradition and reactionary tendencies, or tradition and fundamentalism are poles apart in terms of the traditionalist school per se. Now, the traditional school is conservative in a lot of ways, but it's also, if you look at Frithjof Schuon, it's a little bit wild and crazy in certain ways, but it's a different perspective. It's not conservatism, but it is understanding that the ideally, or in their essence, the major revelations and the major religions that come from the revelations are sort of in a higher order than any other conception of wisdom that the human race has ever come up with. That's what I think. I think that's generally true. The only problem is sometimes traditionalists will like to think that that's the way the religions always have been and always will be and are now. They're looking at a ideal essence, not a false ideal essence, but something that as soon as you look at the religions socio-historically, it's going to have many, many exceptions to that high, vision of what the religion is. And yet it's worth having that high vision.
Well, that's been a very elegant presentation, Charles. I really appreciate having this time with you today. I know because of the fact that you've written some 20 books that we've just scratched the surface. I hope that we have more conversations in the future. I'm very interested in having a separate conversation with you just on your analysis of the UFO rage that's going on now.
I'm warmed up to do that. I've been basically on the podcast circuit about that one. And certainly, that's on the front burner in my life right now.
So I thought it was very important before we get into that topic that the viewers of the New Thinking Aloud channel had a sense of your background, because that's really where you're coming from in terms of all of these other critiques that you've made.
Yeah, I think we pretty well covered it, and I just, and I would like to add that probably if I hadn't been a Catholic in a more or less pre-Vatican II church and gone through Catholic school and Catholic high school, that's my formal education, ended with Catholic high school. In Catholic high school, at least you get an idea of what a Catholic what a classical education is, and you get an idea of what metaphysics is. You don't really get taught metaphysics, but it's there, and there's a classical education. You've heard of Pindar, for example. You know what I mean? And you get this in high school, and it was very interesting because the Catholic Church, while it was intact, which it is no longer, had a completely unified vision which included every aspect of life. And people don't get that now. And I saw that. And as that started to fall apart, strangely enough, LSD came in at that very moment. There was Second Vatican Council, LSD, like that. So like LSD was a great booby prize in my life for the loss of the Catholic Church, which I wouldn't have stayed. Either people stayed with it. I couldn't stay with it. I saw the priests that were teaching me didn't really believe. They had no faith. So I had to go elsewhere.
Well, Charles, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. I feel like even though we have very different outlooks on life, there's a certain kinship from our years living together in the same little town as San Rafael.
Yeah, San Rafael. Old San Rafael, yeah. A mission town, You have that ghost of the missions are still there,
Well, thank you so much for being with me today.
Yeah, it was very enjoyable, and I hope we can do this again sometime soon.
I look forward to it. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.